into a discussion of the Tibetan Book of the Dead. And all along he's been saying, this is the leitmotif, the refrain of the essay, is all things are within us in potentiality. And then he moves into discussing the archetypes. He's picked up the Jungian vocabulary. All the archetypes are within us. All the archetypes are the gods. The gods are within us. And he moves into this whole area. Then he says, everything that we repress in our life comes up in negative form. This is the Jungian vision of the shadow. But devils, for example, he says, in the great traditions are simply repressed gods. When a culture moves in and suppresses the deities of a local tradition, they become the devils of that tradition because they have been repressed. And everything that is repressed comes back as a devil because it is desiring love and attention and compassion. So we all contain all the gods within us. And we're always choosing to play a role in life, and we're suppressing other roles. So then he goes in part 2 and he shows, well, what happens in the Tibetan Book of the Dead when the soul moves into the bardo, the gray realm. Suddenly his psyche explodes and all the gods are out here now. But the initiate, unless he has learned these lessons in his life, ideally, unless he was a yogi, will not know that the gods are within him. And so he will experience fear. The primary clear radiance, the blinding white light, which corresponds to the Sahasrara, the Tibetan Book of the Dead turns out to be the Kundalini in reverse, as you sink down toward Earth, toward the next physical incarnation. The primary white radiance, if there's still some ego there, will be experienced as terrifying instead of blissful. So there's still karma that needs to be purged. So you'll drop down to the next level. And the wrathful deities will come in at the level of the throat chakra. And they will begin assaulting you and trying to pull you apart. And the initiate will have to learn that these beings are projections of his consciousness. Do not fear them. If he still doesn't learn that, you keep dropping down until eventually the soul is attracted by the love-making generated by the heat of a specific couple, and then attains into full earthly incarnation. And you have been reborn because you haven't purged all the karma that has been necessary to liberate you into oneness with the primary clear radiance. So he says, basically, when all the gods are assaulting you, the primary deities, the wrathful deities, and so forth, it's as though the consciousness of the person has been exploded out around him. So then he moves, interestingly enough, into this third section with this discussion of this guy Staudenmeier. He says, well, what then is the point of the comparison with these yogic systems with Western psychology? And he says, I found this interesting case of this guy named Staudenmeier who lived a very repressed life. He started out as a clergyman and went through the seminary and did everything he had to do, and then decided he didn't want to do it after about a year. So then he went over to natural science and he became a chemist, and he learned about chemistry, and he never married. He lived a celibate life, and he spends all of his life repressing, just these books and texts. It's almost like the Faust experience. And then somebody suggests to him, you really ought to find out what's going on in those spiritualist seances. When people will start automatic writing. Have you ever tried that? Maybe you should try that. And so he laughs about it, but then he goes back into his study and he starts trying it, automatic writing. And then he says, after a while, these personalities start crystallizing. And I realized that 3 personalities came up. The first one was His Highness, which was this personification of this snooty nobleman who looked askance at cartoons or laughter of any kind. And he began to talk to me inside the ground. And then the next one that would come up was the child archetype. And I realized, Zimmer says he never had children, and so that repression has now come up as the child. And he would go places, and the child would tell him he wants to go play, so he has to go play. He has to be playful now. And then this third thing would come up that he called roundhead, because it would remind him of this little rubber ball that he squeezed and the tongue would come out. And this is the trickster, the one who just wants to make fun of everyone. And then as the process goes on, the guy is, in Jungian terms, is becoming schizophrenic. His psyche is disintegrating. It's doing exactly the opposite of the individuation process. Instead of integrating, now it's pulling apart into all these, what in the Tibetan Book of the Dead would be the deities coming at you. They're just coming out of him. He says, roundhead started taking over my tongue, and it started wanting to force itself out of my mouth all of the time. And Zimmer says that's a little bit like the recognition in Kundalini Yoga that these gods are inhabitants of the various organs of the body. And he would say, well, these other complexes would come up, goatfoot and horsefoot, and they would be these little impish demons, and they were in my bowels, and they were causing me all sorts of gastric problems and so forth. And he just goes on with this, and finally he ended up in a hospital. He also started, gets into very bizarre areas where he starts thinking he's developed CDs, and he can heal cuts just by applying consciousness to them. I mean, he's just having a blast with this stuff. And it goes on for year after year, and he finally does end up in a hospital and dies. And but he saw it. He managed basically to retain enough rationality to write this memoir. And it's very clear and lucid about what happened to him.
I thought it was,
and
but I
yes.
thought anybody seeing that from the outside would think he was obviously psychotic.
Yes, but he saw the whole thing as this experiment. You know, he's thinking it's a kind of spiritual discipline. And so Zimmer holds this up as the relationship of Western psychology to Eastern psychology is the gods are indeed within us, and what Jung started out calling them complexes later became the archetypes, but the Hindus have already known about them in these various personifications. So I just wanted to throw one last image at you while we're on this, and this is, I've often thought about the parallels between Kundalini Yoga and the Ptolemaic conception of the universe. This is from the Renaissance, from Gathurius's Practica Musici, and it's amazing. They knew, of course, nothing about Kundalini Yoga, but they picked up the Hermetic tradition that we talked about last time. And it's amazing the equivalences that you can find in the Ptolemaic vision of the spheres of the cosmos, and there were classically 7 of them, as there are 7 chakras in the Kundalini. And here we have this serpent going down instead of going up, and it ends in 3 heads, which is the 3-headed Cerberus who guards the underworld in the classical tradition. And then, according to each of these spheres, this is the earthly sphere, and that corresponds right on to the Muladhara from the start. This is Earth, which is in the center of creation, and this is Talia, who is one of the muses. She is not heard because you are unconscious. It's basically the Shakti wrapped around in this cave, slumbering at the beginning. And then Cerberus is represented as a lion, which is the symbol for pride, the ego, and a wolf. And in Dante, it's a leopard he encounters as he begins to enter into the Inferno, but here the wolf becomes a dog. The dog represents the future, and the wolf represents the past. Something like, I've forgotten, lust and fear, perhaps. And then as you move up out, you get the 4 elements, aqua, air, fire, and then you move out into the realm of Muna, the moon, and up to Mercury, Venus, the Sun, and so forth, and correlated with each of these are the 9 muses, the classical 9 muses, each one of which was a patron of one of the various arts, epic, poetry, history, and so forth. So the muses are correlated, and they're clothed. Art is the clothing of the radiance, the mystery dimension. And here, the 3 graces appear unclothed, because now we're in the transcendent realm. This would correspond Apollo would correspond to the Sahasrara, because Apollo is the god of the sun, and the sun door is the door into which the soul dissolves in the Eastern traditions. But because he's pictured with form, it would be the Agya. So the 2 have not been differentiated here. But he is the radiant mover of all of creation. The spheres are turning because they are inspired by the unmoved mover, who is here personified and syncretized with Apollo. And you go down through the constellations. You have Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, and of course you can correlate Venus with the Svadhisthana, the erotic principle, Mars with the Manipura, the will to power, and gets trickier with these others. Saturn possibly could also be correlated because of the weight and heaviness with the Muladhara, and Mercury possibly with the Jung says the intellect begins to emerge at the heart chakra. So they do map on very well. And here we have the 3 graces. One is turned out because she represents the divine radiance down pouring into time, and the other one is turned toward him. She represents the soul turning back in the Platonic theory of education, rediscovering the face you had before you were born, the Platonic forms, going back to the divine and the static point in between. And so the whole thing is the Western Hermetic traditional equivalent to the Kundalini Yoga. So I've often wondered if the Kundalini, not that there's any relationship between Kundalini Yoga and the Ptolemaic, but if the psyche has not spontaneously projected out in the Western cosmos